transformers have an effect on the sound in that they change the transient performance, but they also distort. So we have, and again, depending on what they're made of, sort of steel, nickel, combinations of the two, we have a distortion profile for that transformer that gives it a particular character. Hi everyone, welcome back to Greenroom's 1. So just before we go into look at our overheads that were part of this particular session, we're actually going to talk about something a little bit different and a little bit of a sort of extra factor that you'll find, great recording engineers, something that they take into account in all of their sessions, but something that you may have taken into account in your sessions here, but also something that might be new to you in thinking about how you want to work. So traditionally, if you come into this room, you're quite likely to record through the microphone preamp that's within this Audient ASP8024 desk, which is an amazing preamp. It's what's called a transformerless preamp. I always think of it as being quite punchy, relatively clean, but there is good punch to it. And as you start to push the preamp, it definitely gets punchier for me, but in quite a sort of clean and transient way. The transient comes through this preamp really quickly. It's a very fast mic pre. And can, as I say, be incredibly clean, so it suits all sorts of genres of music production. But often you walk into a studio and you might see multiple different mic pre's in the studio. You often see potentially 3 different colours of mic pre often appearing within studios. Thinking about classic recording studios, you'll often see something clean like the Audient here, maybe something like a Neve, and then maybe an API or something like that. These are the kind of sort of ideas that come into our heads, I think, when we think about microphone preamp choices. And in the same way, in this studio here, we've got some Focusrite ISA pre's, or down in the rack down there. We've got the Audient pre that sits in here, but we also have the API pre's, and we have a number of API pre's in this room. There's 4 sets of 4 API mic pre's that you can patch into using the patch bay in the corner of the studio, allowing you, instead of running into the console, to run into those mic pre's. And I think the reason why it matters is because these mic pre's have an effect on your sound. I always like to say that 100% of the potential of your recording starts before you even sit down and go to record. It's in that pre-production. It's when you go and see that band for the first time, where you work with that artist, working with that producer, whoever it is you're working with, whatever genre you're working with. If you're going to extract the maximum from your record, you want to be making the most of every little part. So if you drop 10% in the recording stage or in the production stage, if you smash that mix, you can only ever achieve 90% of what you could have done. We don't want to be losing potential. So a change in mic pre might give us something that we want for our record. Now, the mic pre in the Audient and the mic pre in the API are very, very different mic pre's. The API's got a quite colourful op amp, but also runs into a transformer. And that transformer plays a number of different roles within the mic pre itself. It adds gain, but it's a passive component that adds gain. And as part of that sort of gain process, we also get this sort of magnetic distortion that happens when we run through a transformer. If you measure a square wave, you expect to see that square, don't you? That hard line. Whereas if you put a square wave into a transformer, it rounds off that. So again, we're actually losing some of the transient. It's elongating that attack. And to me, it's a sort of, I suppose you could almost see it if you were sort of to exaggerate it, a bit like somebody putting a wallet on a snare drum to get that fatter, deeper sound, or some kind of ring to dampen a snare in a particular way. Transformers have an effect on the sound in that they change the transient performance, but they also distort. So we have, and again, depending on what they're made of, sort of steel, nickel, combinations of the two, we have a distortion profile for that transformer that gives it a particular character. I often like to think about these mic pre's as being like people with characters, and you could draw a cartoon that represented that character. And I think a lot of people associate API with being a sort of punchy, rocky, really favoured for drums. And again, you'll see people often driving that preamp really hard to push the op amp and the transformer in the preamp into some kind of saturation to add some colour, which creates that gesture of, perhaps what it does is, instead of that drummer being sat passively, you picture that drummer hitting harder. You picture that bass player digging their finger in a little bit more when you use that DI on that mic pre. So we're really, we've got electronics affording some kind of perceptual change in our listener, which is so powerful. If we can change the way our listener feels about our music, That's what we're here to do. We're here to, really represent that music best way possible, and we can do that by using these tools and understanding how they work, why we would choose to use them, and employing them when it's the appropriate thing to do. So, for example, I don't really want to sway you here in terms of opinions. I want you to listen and find your own opinion. And I say, going back to those criteria about what does it do to the tone, what does it do to the transient, what does it do to the presentation of the sort of gesture of the performance. Those are great things to listen for. But for example, I often find with an API pre, I don't like what it does to cymbal detail, but I love what it does to a kick and a snare drum. And you can find out for yourself in the session, labelled in the session. There's a couple of different playlists, one of which where the mics were gone through the console pre, and then in the last playlist we move in and we've got certain mics that are then going back through the API. So all the sort of close mics plus a pair of overheads going through the API. So you can hear what happens when we switch from the console preamp to the API preamp. And something that you might want to think about when you're working in the studios. Most of our studios do give you some kind of alternative. Maybe you want to use something very particular for a vocal. Sometimes actually, you want to think about, I often think about tone as being a triangle. And I often think that perhaps I want something, something that lifts my vocal out tonally as the top of my pyramid, something that really makes my drums groove in the bottom left-hand corner and the bottom right-hand corner. I want something that's sort of clean, that allows the piano in my track to just sit. If they're all in the same colour, I don't get that separation. So I can also use preamp choice to create this little differentiation that brings those elements together. So if my drums are in the APIs, for example, I create this kind of cohesive sound through the APIs on the drums, whilst the rest of my band are going through the console. Or maybe I actually want to separate out cymbals from drums. Again, I think often on records now, particularly sort of all the electronic produced, sampled, overdubbed, reinforced, all sorts of ways of using drums now in modern production, that again we can use the nature of the distortion, the presentation of these preamps to give us some kind of new and exciting sound. So something for you to hear, something for you to try. Give it a go. There's so much to choose from here, and all of these things can help make your record sound the way you want it to sound.